Hi there, I'm Timothy Linsdau, video producer, Christian, and also a lover of science. Of course, today is the anniversary of the launch of the Apollo 11 to land the first man on the moon. And that would be July 16th, 1969. That was the launch date. And that was a pretty big, exciting day. If you will like and comment on my video and subscribe to my channel to support it, would be terrific. Thank you. When we think about John F. Kennedy making that proclamation only 8 years earlier, and I believe it's 8 years and 1 month earlier, he made that proclamation that we would land on the moon, put men on the moon in that 8 years, 1 month later, which is really incredible. Since the U.S. was behind from the beginning in the space race, from the time the Russians put up Sputnik, we were always one step behind, but eventually we caught up and surpassed them. The space exploration in the beginning definitely was a race, definitely had a lot to do with the Cold War and those issues. The Russians were doing pretty good at first. One of the problems they had was the rocket they had was so complicated, and it blew up once, several times on their main launching cosmodrome, killing many of their scientists. Caused them a lot of trouble. There's some timeline history again. JFK in '61 making that commitment that we would make it to the moon before the decade was out, which is really astounding. But we were in a race which accelerated everything that we did. There were 400,000 people working on the Apollo mission itself, which was more than all that worked on the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb, which I guess you could say is pretty neat. In May 18th, Apollo 10 lifted off from Kennedy Space Center to launch as a dress rehearsal for Apollo 11, and it's all successful. And then July 16th is the launch date for the Apollo 11. Now the astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were the three astronauts that were chosen to be the first manned crew to step onto the moon. Of course, Neil Armstrong became the first man to step on the moon with his famous, "It's a small step for man and a giant leap for mankind." Now you might have heard me slip in the indefinite article A. And he said, he said that he did say a small step for a man, but nobody heard it. It's possible with the difficulty of transmission at the time from the moon to here, to the Earth, that he did say it, because it's a little odd otherwise. And that's, there's another bit of trivia for what he said and when. Landing on the moon, they struggled to get down. There were only about 17 seconds of fuel just before they landed, before they would have had to ignite their escape rocket engine and go back to the command module and come back to the Earth unsuccessful. And that would have been the least painful of what could have happened if something really went wrong. In fact, President Nixon at the time had already written a letter, an announcement, if the astronauts had not made it back. Of course, Michael Collins, being in the command module orbiting the moon, could have easily have returned if something had happened to Armstrong and Aldrin. And thank God it didn't. Every little bit of that mission worked, and that's what's incredible. Many of the engineers, those in charge, weren't really admitting that something would be a disaster, but they were thinking with as difficult as it has been to develop this program, that this first mission probably would be somewhere along the line called off, and they would get back in command module and return home and try again. But everything worked. Everything clicked and everything was perfect. They made their famous moonwalk, that famous first step. You may have heard, I don't know if you've ever heard Buzz Aldrin, Edwin Aldrin, speak, but he's kind of a salty character. He's pretty funny. And actually, he's a bit disgusted with the space program that after the end of the Apollo 17 that we never did anything else in going beyond Earth orbit. He's always said that he was disappointed that that happened. But anyway, as he's coming down the ladder, you may have noticed he kind of sticks his leg out for kind of a second. He said he needed to fill his urine bag. And he said he was the first astronaut to take a leak on the moon. So there you are. There's a little funny trivia also for you. But amazingly enough, it all worked. And they got back, and we had, well, all told, 11, 12, 13. Of course, we know about Apollo 13. They had an oxygen blowout, but amazingly, they put it all together and got back alive. 14, 15, 16, 17, that's 7 moon missions where they either were going to land or landed, and the only one that didn't was 13. And that was the end of the moon project. And now, of course, they're talking about it, and private firms are talking about doing this by building the next generation rocket, which is going to be the biggest rocket ever built and the most powerful. Up to that time, of course, it's the Saturn V, which was the biggest rocket ever built that put man on the moon. And it was done and designed and into successful operation very quickly. Some of you may know that Werner von Braun was the head scientist of that, understood that they had to come up with a component system, stages, if you will, first, second, third stage, to be able to get that much material pushed into space at an orbitable speed, and eventually 25,000 miles an hour to get out of orbit and go to the moon. That rocket was over the Saturn rocket was over 36 stories tall. And it held an incredible amount of kerosene and liquid oxygen is what it burned. And statistically, the first stage burnt more fuel in 1 second than Charles Lindbergh's plane burned the entire trip across the Atlantic. Amazing. That first stage carried more than 203,000 gallons of kerosene and 318,000 gallons of liquid oxygen. The 5 F-1 rocket engines ignited and produced 7.5 million pounds of thrust to lift that rocket and all its components and those astronauts. The second stage had 260,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen fuel and 80,000 gallons of liquid oxygen. That's a lot of burning, baby. That pushed them up into orbit and eventually onto the moon, which is an incredible story. Each one of the astronauts had their story to tell. I thought it was interestingly enough that all 3 astronauts were born in 1930. Michael Collins had failed in his first attempt to apply as an astronaut, but succeeded in his second attempt. And he also had back surgery along the way, and still was chosen to be the command pilot on the command module of the mission, and which is pretty amazing. And he's 88 years old and still going strong, talking about the mission. somebody asked him what it was like on the command module by himself, and he said, well, it was kind of lonely, but my coffee was warm and everything was good. And people ask him, well, what did you say when those first two astronauts got back into command module after being on the moon? And he says he can't remember that he said much of anything, other than the fact he said those beautiful white spacesuits were covered with moon dust on the legs and was going to mess up his command module. He would say something like that, I think. Buzz Aldrin, as you know, he's still around and supporting the space missions, the idea of space missions. He actually was in one of the Transformer movies, and pretty interesting character. And Neil Armstrong died last year. He was always a real humble person about it all. He made the point that it took hundreds of thousands of people to put him onto the moon, and he was just one man in that process to get that job done. So, looking forward to these next projects to getting back to the moon will be exciting, and of course, eventually Mars. Whether it's of profit to us in actual dollars to be there is not the point of the profit that we make in figuring out how to get there and how to get back alive. All the things that are developed from that. So, what an amazing thing. This is the day of the launch of the first moon landing. And on the 20th, we will celebrate the actual stepping onto the moon of 1969. So, well, I hope you enjoyed a little bit of that trivia and history. And we'll talk a little bit more about this history. It's terrific stuff. So, thanks for coming along on this little mission. And as usual, get out there and make it a great day.